Good evening. What a great evening it's been already. I uh, I so I was going to talk about the Civil War some tonight. We're kind of to that point in Restoration history, and very important. I think something I never really realized, I guess, until several years ago, as I studied this, how important the Civil War was in actually in religious history in the United States, and it also made me study to a large extent, made me study the little bit more about the Civil War in general. I don't know where I'm totally got lost. Hold on a minute, flipping on me. Come on, thing. There we go. So what will divide us, right? Well, there's things that united us. Baptism for the forgiveness of sins, immersion, unscriptural names, synods, autonomous, self-governed congregations. Those were things that united the movement. But as we move towards the Civil War, talk some about the Missionary Society, American Christian Missionary Society, which was a big thing. It was the start of the division that would divide the Stone Campbell movement. It was the number one thing in the beginning that caused that division. But like I said, whenever I was here last, it had a lot deeper root than just the Missionary Society. It's a lot deeper root than just the instrument. But as we moved forward towards the Civil War, I don't know if you knew this or not, but James Garfield, President of the United States, was a member of the Church of Christ, if you knew that or not. He was an elder in the Church of Christ. Matter of fact, James Garfield said, I stepped down from a higher office to take a lower office when he became President of the United States. But, as much as that sounds wonderful about James Garfield, he was also on the Union side, right? He was a Northerner. And he showed up to an American Christian Missionary Society in a Union uniform. This was before the Civil War, but things were already becoming heated. So, that's division, isn't it? That was, it made the Missionary Society more of a northern thing. It excluded a lot of the southern. What was the Civil War really about? What was the Civil War really about? States' rights, right? Huh? Yeah, states' rights. Exactly what the Civil War was about. Civil War was not necessarily about slavery. Matter of fact, slavery wouldn't be emancipated until after the Civil War. Civil War was about states' rights. Some states said we want to have the right to be a slave state, and we don't want the government to say we can't do that. Some states said we want the right to be a non-slave state, and we don't, or a free state, we would call it, and we want the government to say we can't do that. So really, that's what the Civil War was about. It's interesting to me today with marijuana, how states' rights have once again become a pivotal issue, haven't they? It's federally illegal, right? But states legalize it. States' rights, right? And that causes problems, like Ron says, it's all about money. That causes a lot of problems. So the division is coming. And Campbell and Stone and Raccoon Smith and McGreary, which he died at the beginning of the Civil War, they knew that the division was occurring. Now, Campbell's followers were mostly in the north, the Campbellites. He was from Pennsylvania, Virginia, northern states. The Stone movement was in Kentucky, further to the south. Okay? And at the time of the Civil War, Campbell and Stone were still the primary leaders of this movement. That's going to change because they're going to die shortly. They're getting old, right? So that's going to change. And those two men, interestingly, both opposed Christians fighting in the Civil War. They both said, how can a brother take up arms against a brother? Right? Because you got churches in the north, you got churches in the south. So as much as we said about the Civil War, physical brother fighting, physical brother fighting physical brother, or family fighting family, you had Christians on both sides of those lines, brothers and sisters in Christ on both sides of that Mason-Dixon line, that were going to kill each other. Now, that doesn't sound very Christian to me. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very Christian to me. So Stone and Campbell both wanted to find another solution other than war. And there were other solutions put forth besides going to war. Now, when you're in high school and junior high history, your teachers never tell you that. They never tell us that. We think the war was a black and white slavery issue and there was no choice. We had to go kill each other. That's the view we're told as children. That's the view I was told as children. We never were given the idea, the thought process that, do we really have to go to war? Well, Campbell and Stone didn't think we did. A lot of people didn't think that we needed to go to war. A lot of people thought there was a lot better solution than war. And they ranged anywhere from buying all the slaves and putting them in ships and sending them back to Africa. That was one proposal, actually, was to buy the slaves back, pay everybody for their slaves, and actually put them on ships and send them back to Africa. That was one proposal, actually. And there was another proposal that basically said we should compensate over a period of time. Slave owners should be compensated for the slaves, and it should be abolished. Basically, it would cease to exist in a few years. Basically, we just buy the slaves off. The government would buy the slaves off. There's other factors going on, isn't there? Machinery, the cotton gin. Other things are beginning to come on the scene. Slaves aren't going to be as necessary in just a little while, right? Because the labor force isn't going to be as necessary in a little while. Things are changing. There's a lot of argument that if it had just been postponed a while, it would have resolved. So there's a lot of thought about, do we really need to go to war? Now, the other thing that's a problem is that if you're a Southern church, the war was bitter. They hated each other. If you've ever studied the Civil War and you've ever read about Sherman's March to the Sea, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Sherman's March to the Sea? What was Sherman's March to the Sea? What did he do? Burned everything. Burned their crops, burned their houses, killed everybody, cleared a path, scorched earth all the way to the sea, right? Sherman's March to the Sea. It became more than just defeating them. It was about destroying them, humiliating them, making them poverty-stricken. So after the war, what happens? The North's got all the industry, right? The North's got all the prosperity. The northern cities weren't burned. The northern cities weren't torched. The northern cities weren't destroyed. The southern cities, they're starving to death. They burn their crops. They burn their food. They ain't got no money. They got all kinds of slaves. Some of them slaves didn't even want to be set free, right? And now you got all kinds of slaves down there that are free, and now guess what? You got to do something with them, don't you? They got to eat. They got to survive. They got to come up with a way to live. People in the South still don't care much for slaves, don't care much for black people at this point, right? Not a very friendly environment to be free. I mean, you're free, but it's, you get the point? So what happens? Southern churches, they get very embittered against the northern churches because the northern churches aren't supporting them. So the northern churches are building buildings, and we're getting pretty quick, they're going to be putting these expensive organs in these buildings. And the southern churches, who are still Church of Christ, still same movement, right? They're starving to death. In the north, they still hate them. you see? And so the division becomes broad because you have brethren on both sides of this line that are not considering each other. You understand? It's divisive, more than divisive. It's, you can't get around it. So the Civil War becomes this dividing part where we talk about the Civil War uniting the country, but in reality, the Civil War divided our country to a large extent. It divided our country. And it put the people in the South in a state of poverty. And we still see the ripples of that today, don't we? We still see the ripples of the Civil War in our society today, even this far out, because it was the bloodiest war we've ever fought. You know that? The Civil War was by far the bloodiest war we've ever fought. Matter of fact, if you take all them little wars like the Spanish-American and all them, and you take World War I, and you take World War II, and you take Korea, and you're in the middle of Vietnam before we kill as many people in war as we killed during the Civil War. You have to do that many wars to get to the number of people that we killed of each other during the Civil War. That's how bloody the Civil War was. Nothing glamorous about war. And there's nothing glamorous about a country that decides the best way to resolve the difference is to shoot each other. And I think we over-glamorize it a lot. Myself. It was bloody, it was bitter, it was divisive. It tore our country apart, and it tore our churches apart. And that was really one of the very divisive splits that occurred in American religion, was the Civil War. So when we start to consider the ramifications, there's a book, it's kind of dog-eared, because I've read it about 400 times. I read it a couple of times when I went to Italy, but it's called Torn Asunder. It's a little short book by Ben Brewster, but it's called Torn Asunder. And it really defines the division of the movement, Stone Campbell movement, and a lot of the things that became points that started to occur. So now you've got Southern churches that don't have instruments as we get into instrument phrase, because plain and simply, they can't afford it. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, they can't afford it. They're starving down here, right? Northern churches, as we begin to talk about instruments, northern churches begin to adopt instruments because they're wealthy. They're in a better state. So instrumental music issue becomes not just a doctrinal issue, it becomes a financial issue, you see? And that further divides the movement. So things are happening on a theological level and a physical level that are dividing the unity of the movement. So a lot of us depends on which side we were on. You understand? Which side we were on in this conflict that occurred. So a lot of them, they said, you shouldn't fight in the war. Stone said, Campbell said, don't fight. But on the other hand, a lot of them said, as we would say when we talk about war, right? I've had this question posed to me. What about Christians fighting in wars? As we often say when we talk about wars, we're subject to our government, right? So Christians in the north, Christians in the south, we're subject to our government. If our government says we need to go fight, then we need to go fight. Was that the right thing to do? Moral thing to do? Godly thing to do? Stone and Campbell said no. Don't go fight. But Stone's boy was an infantryman. A lot of them were putting on uniforms, going to war, fighting each other. Christian against Christian, killing each other. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know what I would have done, for sure. But to me, from a God standpoint, to kill another member of the church, to kill another Christian, well, you don't know in war, do you? Bullets are nondescript, right? Seen that in Tulsa, right? Bullets don't care who they hit. They hit whoever is in their way, right? Doesn't matter if you're evil or good or a father or doesn't matter, right? A bullet's a bullet. A bullet doesn't care. So that's a difficult question, isn't it, for us to answer? What do you think? I don't know that you can distinguish. For me to kill, that's just too hard a question to answer. To kill another brother in Christ, I think, is to go to war against a person you know is a Christian, you know is just like you, to me, that kind of takes it to a higher level. Absolutely. You get into a deep theological, and people struggle with that, right? Christians struggle with that when they're called to go to war. Christians struggle with, and they should. You know, is it right for me to go and shoot somebody else as a Christian or not? And of course, there's always the argument. Well, in old times, the Old Testament, they killed each other by the score, and nobody thought anything about it. But in the New Testament, we don't have that example, do we? So, yeah, yeah, well, I could make it a little more personal. If you were on one side of that line, Gary, and I was on the other side, and I knew you, there's no way I would kill you. I don't care who told me I had to do it. I just wouldn't do it. Right. But I think from a religious standpoint, the Civil War, that was a difference in the Civil War. They did know those churches on that side, and those churches knew those churches on this side. They did know each other. Right. Oh, right. And I agree with that on that start, but I think that's what made the Civil War and Christianity, the church, I think it's what made it unique. I think that's what made the Civil War in the United States so divisive and so unique, is that they did know. And it was more than that. The Christians in the South, they felt so humiliated and slighted and tread upon by the Christians in the North. Because once the war was over, even, the churches in the North weren't rebuilding, weren't offering support, weren't sending money, weren't supporting the churches in the South. The hate had taken over by that point, and that relationship, it had destroyed that relationship. And so Southern churches felt really slighted by Northern churches. They're like, well, you're our brothers. You've got money. You're going well. We're starving to death. You're not sending us anything. So it went beyond the war. It went beyond the bullets. It went to the point that it was humiliation, and it was, there was no mercy being shown by Christians in the North to Christians in the South, not in the sense that you think it would be. They weren't helping them to rebuild, helping them to eat, helping them. They were leaving them in the state. So it became, from a religious standpoint, either right or wrong, them killing each other, even beyond the Civil War. From a religious standpoint, it became very divisive between Northern and Southern churches, and it really started to put that line in place between what we would call Disciples of Christ, Christian Church, and Church of Christ. And a lot of that came from the Civil War. Most church, what you would consider traditional churches of Christ, most of that, we were on the southern side of the Mason-Dixon line. Most of what you call the rest of them were on the northern side of the Mason-Dixon line. And that's not wholeheartedly true. That's not 100% true, but to a large extent. And we see that as David Lipscomb comes upon the scene. And most of you have probably heard of David Lipscomb, right? Lipscomb University in Tennessee. David Lipscomb really became the voice of the southern churches, because after Campbell and them passed away, he really began to take that a little bit, take that role a little bit. But then we moved on. Instrumental music, paid preachers, conventions. All these became divisive. Can you pay a preacher? Can you not pay a preacher? Instrumental music. Can we use an instrument? Can we not use an instrument? The Missionary Society, conventions, organizations, a lot of the things that they were trying to get away from that were creeping back in, because that's how we do. We do that. And so lines began to get drawn. But as of this point, we're still considered one movement. Even though there's issues, right? We're still considered one movement. But the leaders are dying. Stone's dying, Campbell's dying. People are having to take those places. McGreary and Lipscomb and Fanning. Tolbert Fanning was real Southern. Lipscomb lost a lot in the war. Lost his child because he couldn't get the medical care, because he couldn't get through Army checkpoints. Child died. He had great personal loss from the Civil War. Tremendous personal loss from the Civil War, David Lipscomb did, directly resulting from the war. Not during the war, but after the war. Things that he couldn't get medical care, couldn't get help, couldn't get food, couldn't get things because they weren't providing those things. He suffered great loss from that. But yet, in spite of that, he really wrote and tried to keep things together. But it was difficult for him to do that. And there were a lot of other people coming on the scene. And a lot of the people, McGreary, he was for the Missionary Society, but against instrumental music. Him and Lipscomb never could. Lipscomb was against the Missionary Society and against instrumental music. So started drawing all these lines in the sand. Well, the missionary side is okay, but instrumental music's not okay. Well, instrumental music's okay, but we can't pay a preacher. Well, you can pay a preacher, but we can't be in a convention. You see what I mean? Started drawing lines, You can do this, but you can't do that. But yet it's coming back to the same theological base. Where do we overstep the Scripture? Can we do what the Scripture? What about silence of the Scripture? Can we overstep silence of the Scripture? Let's come back to the same theological base. But we're starting to divide and move away from. And then a guy comes on the scene later on, Daniel Sumner. And he really made it divisive. Daniel Sumner was gaining popularity, and he basically came up with what's called the Sand Creek Address. And the Sand Creek Address was attended by about 6,000 people. And Daniel Sumner basically said in the Sand Creek Address, he said, wish I could find it. I think I could find that. He basically said that we don't agree with instrumental music. We don't agree with missionary societies. We don't agree with all this stuff. And if you do, you're no longer our brother. And now, in closing up this address and declaration, we state that we are impelled from a sense of duty to say that all such are as guilty of teaching or allowing or practicing the many innovations to which we have referred, and after being admonished and having had sufficient time for reflection, if they do not turn away from such abominations, that we cannot and will not regard them as brethren. So, Daniel Sumner drew a line in the sand, didn't he? Sand Creek Address. And that was really, that was that, you know, you say there's a point, right? There's a, you know, and Daniel Sumner in the Sand Creek Address, as far as the united movement of the Stone Campbell, was really the line that was drawn in the sand that set people at different sides of the aisle. It drew a swift response from the Christian Standard. An unidentified author who discussed was evident through his sarcastic writing made these comments. Sand Creek is immortal. Sand Creek has taken lessons of the Pope who issued his bull against the comet. Sand Creek will live forever. Lipscomb did not respond to the page of the Gospel Advocate until 3 years later. While agreeing with Sumner's premise, Lipscomb still saw the mass meeting and its subsequent actions without scriptural authority. Lipscomb was kind of always in the middle, trying to keep people together. So we began to get three groups of people. One group of people was on Sumner's side. Anything you do except what we think, anything you do that's crossing that line, we're not going to be brothers with you anymore. We had this other group of people who said, well, we don't really agree with all these innovations, but we're going to leave that up to them to decide, and if they decide to do it, then that's okay. They're still going to be our brothers. We don't not agree with them, but it's all right. And then we had the other group on the other side that drew the other line and said, well, them people who are drawing a line against us, we can't be brothers with them anymore because they don't want to be brethren with us anymore, and they're just stuck in the mud conservative, and we're not going to have anything to do with that. So you got three groups of people now, right? And things start to get more divided because you got these three different groups of people. David Lipscomb took over the Gospel Advocate from Tolbert Fanning, became the editor of the Gospel Advocate. The Gospel Advocate, which still exists today, was a very popular publication, especially among the Southern churches. He had quite a bit of influence. And Lipscomb kind of became the voice of the Church of Christ in the South. The census of 1906 is when the Census Bureau contacted David Lipscomb and said, are the disciples of Christ, the Christian church, and the Church of Christ the same group? And in 1906, David Lipscomb responded back to the U.S. Census Bureau and said, you can no longer consider us the same group. So in 1906, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ officially became two separate religious entities from the U.S. Census Bureau in 1906. So, any questions? Yeah. Do what now? Building ownership. Boy, that is an issue, isn't it? That's really became an issue in the Church of Christ again in the last decade. Several churches have actually been stolen from congregations. Did you know that? Legally, in the last decade. Yeah, it gets really iffy in Churches of Christ because who owns this building? Who owns, you see? We're incorporated. Of course, all the guys who signed the letters of incorporation are dead, right? But we are incorporated. Technically, we all own the building. But in court, that becomes a little bit of an issue sometimes. Should the church own a building? Well, goes back to that same basic theological premise. Show me an example in the New Testament where a church owned a church building. You see? Well, I can't, because there's not a single church in the New Testament that we can know that actually owned a church building. They didn't. They met in houses, they met in synagogues, they met in temple courts, but they didn't own buildings. So if you really want to draw the line on it, is it scriptural for us to own a building? If we're really going to hold that line of doctrine, well, what we say is, no, but it's expedient. We're going to talk about this. This is where this is going. We're going to get to this. It's expedient for us to own a building. So church ownership became an issue. Should we meet in houses? That's how the first century church did it. If we're really going to restore first century church Christianity, then they met in houses. We know that. Right? We know that. So if we're really going to say, yeah, I'm going to restore the first century church, and we're really going to do it just how they did it, then we should be in houses. Right? But we're not. Yeah. Right. So from a literalist standpoint, as Gary said, I hope you heard what he said, because we're really going to talk about this in the next few Wednesday nights. How do we determine? How do we determine doctrine? How do we determine what's right? How do we determine what's not right? How do we determine how we should worship and where we should worship? And how do we determine these things? That's questions we need to know, answers we need to know. From a literalist standpoint, as Gary says, if you're a literalist, you don't need Sunday schools, right? You meet in houses. Your Lord's Supper is around a feast, around your meal. It's not separate. Psalm books, PowerPoints, pews, church buses, fans. None of that's in the New Testament, right? None of that's in the New Testament. So at what point do we say, oh, we can use that, but we don't dare do this? Need to know that. How do we determine that? How do we decide? It's not as easy in white and black as we think a lot of times. And we're going to talk about it. I'm not scared to talk about these things. I think we need to know. I think it's discussions we need to have. And I'm glad we can have them here. I'm glad we can have those discussions here. There's a lot of churches that if we were to do a class like this, there would be problems. People would be against it. But I think it's important we know. I think we need to know. And I think it's important that we know how we determine. All these things became big. Court battles over building ownership. Who owns buildings? Who doesn't own the building? That still occurs today. Buildings have been taken away from congregations by individuals in the courts. So, those problems still exist. We're different. We're different than most all religious bodies around us as far as how we do our buildings, how we pay things, how we do our collections, how we do things. We're different. And from a legal standpoint, sometimes that causes issues, you know? Um, so I have people ask me, that's your church, not my church. I go there. I love it there. It is my church, and the fact it's my assembly, and I go there. But, I don't own this church. I don't own this building. We all own this building. All of us that are members here technically own this building. Go to court with that. You see what I'm saying? From a legal standpoint, it's a little different, right? Dolores is sitting here. Susie's back there. Realtors, from a legal standpoint, that's a little bit different, isn't it? It'd be like going into a house and saying, remember, this family owns this house. There's 15 people in this house. We all own it. Well, you see what I'm saying? Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. But all these things became issues, and issues cause division. Um, so we come up with the question. We're not going to go that far tonight. So we come up with some questions. You should have a lot of questions. 1906, Church of Christ splits. As time's gone on, we look less and less like disciples, and they look less and less like us, and the Christian church looks less and less like us, and we look less and less like them. And sometimes you go to lectureships and stuff, and they're like, well, we're all the same, and we all need to get back together. But the truth is, we're doctrinally on very opposite polar ends of the spectrum by this particular point in history, and I don't know that will ever happen. So, we have to look at that, but we have to look at, even in Church of Christ, like Gary says, like Gary brought up, some churches of Christ are way more literal. One cup, no Sunday school, no kitchens, no building ownership, no paid preachers. Non-institutional, we call that, won't support orphan homes. Some do, some don't. So there's still a million things, even in Church of Christ, that we divide, that we don't agree with, and we draw lines in the sand. They draw lines, we draw lines based on those things that we hold to be doctrine. Yes, Sam? Yeah. Well, if you actually, in Daniel Sumner's defense, later in life, he recanted a lot of that. Later in life, he did soften and changed his views somewhat later in life. But he was a young Spitfire, 30-something-year-old guy at the time he did Sand Creek Address, and he did change his views some and soften some later in life as time went on. But, all these guys have got real fascinating stories. But, we get down at this point, I think we get down to us and what we do, and why we believe what we believe, and why we worship the way we worship, and where do we draw our lines, and I think those are valid, great questions. So we're going to dive off into that a little bit in the next few Wednesday nights. I hope you really get a feel from all this, from way back, from Roman times to now, the evolution of why we are where we are. There's a history behind us, right? There's a history behind our religion, behind our faith. There's centuries and centuries, millennial of history that brought us to this point right now where we're at. You see that? We're a product of the past, right? But then the question inevitably has to become, are we where we need to be now? And why are we where we are right now? So I hope it's been interesting to you. I hope it'll be more interesting as we get into what we do and get into some of these ideas of doctrine and how we determine doctrine. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I love teaching it. I could go hours and hours and bore you to death on most of these guys, but I've chosen to try not to bore you to tears. Yeah.